Our next panel deals with the new dynamics of U.S. trade policy making and negotiations, and I'm thrilled to introduce yet another all-star lineup. There on the far left is Kathleen Claussen, professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She has written more than 6 works concerning trade, investment, and international dispute settlement, among other areas. And she's also acted as counsel or arbitrator in over 24 international disputes. Previously, she served as Associate General Counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Next, we have Amy Porges, who practices international trade and customs law in Washington, D.C. Her trade law experience includes work as Senior Counsel for Dispute Settlement and Head of Enforcement at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, as well as Senior Legal Officer in the Secretariat of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, precursor to the WTO. And next is Meredith Broadbent, a Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She is a former chair of the U.S. International Trade Commission and a former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Industry, Market Access, and Telecommunications. Earlier in her career, she was a senior professional staff member with the Ways and Means Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives, where she was instrumental in the development and passage of the implementing bills for the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Uruguay Round Agreements. And our panel will be moderated by Ken Levinson. Ken is the CEO of the Washington International Trade Association, or WITA, and also of the WITA Foundation. WITA is the world's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to providing a neutral platform for the open and robust discussion of international trade policy and economic issues. Ken has over 30 years of experience working with companies, associations, non-governmental organizations, and governments advocating for innovative solutions to complex public policy challenges. Thrilled to have you all here, and Ken, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jill, and it's great to be back here again. Thanks to Jill O'Donnell, Cheyenne Gerlach, and the memory of Clayton Yeutter, who many of us knew and got to work with over the years. Really pleased to be part of today's symposium and the Advisory Council for the Yeutter Institute. We have a terrific panel, some incredibly smart people here with me that I learn from regularly. We host a lot of webinars on our platform, and these are some of the people I get to have on, and I love some of the people you've pulled together today, Jill. There's just been some great folks. I'm going to have to borrow some of them for my future sessions. So we've talked a lot about in these first two discussions, first with Ted and then with our panel on USMCA, about how U.S. trade law has changed and how things that we are maybe anticipating, expecting in the year to come or in the years to come. But I wanted to go back a little bit and use this panel to talk about how it's supposed to work, because what we're seeing right now is somewhat of a big change. I can trace some of the ways that trade policy has changed in the last 30 years. I was also involved with the original NAFTA and the Uruguay round, and many trade agreements that were negotiated over the 20 years after that, that were following a certain set of rules. And you can say that it changed about 8 years ago when President Trump came into office and he started doing things a little bit differently. But I think you can also go back a little further to 2007. I'm going to date it to when Speaker Pelosi took what we had this law called Fast Track, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that and how trade negotiations were done before, and said, you know, we're not going to follow that, and we're going to redo it. And the truth was, when you have small majorities in the House, or you can make those kinds of changes, and they did, and it was agreed to by President George W. Bush and his administration and Speaker Pelosi. So that was in 2007 to deal with the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. So some of those changes, the process changes were starting at that point, and that's when labor and environmental issues were added as key core trade priorities of the United States. But it really did started changing in 2017, and we're going to talk about, but I want to talk about a little bit and start with Meredith. You know, you worked on the Ways and Means Committee. You've worked at the ITC. We'll get into that a little bit as well. How did the consultation process, how was the executive congressional relationship, how did that work historically? Because I don't think we're seeing a different process now, and Kathleen has written extensively about the executive the use of executive power in trade, but how is it supposed to work? And it matters for this room because this is a way for them to access the process. So we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Let me turn my button on here. Yeah, accessing the process and kind of feeding up the concerns and the market access ambitions that there are across the country, where people are building and growing stuff and they want to sell it to the 95% of consumers that live in the rest of the world. These markets aren't open.
Hold it up a little bit higher.
These markets aren't necessarily open, and you need an aggressive advocate in Washington, either through your members of Congress or the committees of jurisdiction and so forth, to understand that they need to put pressure to get these markets open. And I think the title of this program, Opportunities for Leadership in the Global Trading System, there was really not going to be a lot of opportunities, and maybe the newer agreements that the Biden administration has done show some leadership, but I'm not sure I totally agree. I think if we're going to be writing rules that work in our favor and getting countries to respect the agreements they've already negotiated with us, we're going to have a bipartisan consensus on trade. And historically, it's not been easy. I mean, it's been hard fought, wrangling for, and I started out at the Ways and Means Committee, in the minority, then went to the majority, and then as a trade negotiator at USTR, and it was really a hand-in-glove process, and Amy will go into kind of how the executive branch looks at it, but it starts out with political leadership and vision. You have Ronald Reagan saying in his campaign that he wanted to negotiate a North American trade agreement, and then it goes through, President Bush and Clinton and legislation to authorize it. And that part of it is very, very important in terms of getting market access, because you've got members of Congress and the USTR fighting over what is that negotiating objective, what kind of non-discriminatory treatment do you want for digital products. Later on, we did digital products for agriculture, for intellectual property protection. And it's a very intense, energetic process, and at the end of the day, you have an ability for USTR to lead in international trade negotiations. They walk into a room and they know that what they say can pretty much be trusted, and that the USTR has an ability to go back and implement whatever the concession was. And the process itself is very wonky in terms of being based in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, we need to think about that more than we do, I think, these days, because the authority is invested in the Congress, but as a practical matter, 435 members of Congress can't negotiate market access agreements. So it's a delegated authority under all sorts of guardrails and requirements and processes for consultation. If the president wants to take the leadership role to negotiate with a country, he has to tell Congress 90 days ahead of time so Congress can get the appropriate input from the stakeholders. The statute requires reports from trade advisory committees and different kind of non-governmental groups in terms of, will this, and this is after the agreement is negotiated, will this actually bring benefits to the U.S. economy? And then the other wonkish part of the process is the International Trade Commission, which does a probable economic effects test of the whole agreement once it's concluded. And this all helps Congress assess what is in this deal that the administration has gone and negotiated on its behalf. And it's a very creative process that ran its course for many years. I think the old paradigm is breaking up right now, and we're on the cusp of hopefully building something new. But we can learn a lot from the vestiges of the old system, because it really made Congress wrangle out a compromise. It was bipartisan, center of the road. Free trade parts of both parties really solidified it. So I would just urge, if we want leadership in the trading system, we need to think about, how do we get our consensus back again, and what is that process?
Thank you, Meredith. I've been part of that conversation as well in different capacities. Amy, you've been a negotiator. You've been in various roles in government and in the private sector. When you've been part of negotiating teams, how did the process work from your perspective, or how was it supposed to work, and how did it work?
Well, okay.
Yes.
Is this on?
Not yet. There you go.
Is this on? Okay. Okay, so how has it worked? So let me just say that one of the problems with Congress right now, with getting, is this on? One of the problems with Congress right now is Congress, okay? Congress, you know, the House of, my God, look at the House of Representatives. What have they actually enacted this year? Practically nothing. We've had weeks and weeks of gyrations and arguments back and forth, even within the majority, about what they might do, what they won't do. Parties that won't block that will block anything except what their ideal is. It's really, we are really in a state of distress. I think we're not in a good place. Just saying, okay. And I certainly hope whatever the next majority is, it will work a lot better and be more effective, at least, at even passing legislation that does bipartisan compromises. Because, of course, trade when it worked was a bipartisan compromise. So for much of our history, it wasn't bipartisan. During the 19th century, tariffs yo-yoed up and down. They were up when the industrial North dominated. They were down when the South and West, which were agrarian, dominated. Dissension over tariffs was, in fact, one of the causes of the Civil War. You had some people were talking of the McKinley tariff, which was really high in the late 19th century. But of course, in the West, you had William Jennings Bryan, who was for free trade. So again, you had sectional and partisan dissension over tariffs. So result being that the Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs very selectively and sky high on some things. And then in 1934, Cordell Hull of the agrarian state of Tennessee had the insight of getting the Congress to pass grants where Congress would delegate to the executive branch the ability to negotiate about tariffs, and then to make tariff agreements and to proclaim the results. This eventually led to the biggest tariff agreement of all, which was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1948. And throughout that process, there were, in fact, private sector advisory committees of a sort. There was a robust relationship with Congress. Congress had a lot of input. In fact, it was largely from input from Congress that persuaded the United States not to back away from something called the International Trade Organization, negotiated in the late 40s and simply abandoned. So things went onward, okay? In 1962, Congress created the USTR as a bridge between agriculture and industry. Because they felt that the State Department wasn't really robustly representing the United States enough. And so in 1968, so there they were doing tariff agreements. And then the problem was that once you got tariffs down, you still have non-tariff barriers. And the very first non-tariff agreement Congress rejected in 68, and in 74 they invented something known a special method of treating tariff agreements and trade agreements, in which you would be able to have Congress would set the objectives through this process that Meredith has described, a long argument between all parties represented in Congress about what the negotiating objectives should be, what they shouldn't be, what should be off the table, what should be on the table. And once that was passed, then the executive branch would use its constitutional authority to go out and negotiate agreements, and then it would negotiate an agreement, but it would bring that back, and the agreement and its implementing legislation would get special fast treatment by Congress with no amendments, in theory. So that's the framework known as fast track and now known as trade promotion authority. So the deal is the executive branch gets to negotiate an agreement and bring it back and have an up or down vote on the whole thing, but in return, they have to consult and consult and consult. They have to really listen to Congress. They have to listen to the committees of jurisdiction. In fact, they listen to any member who has an important voice. They listen to your members, your senators, your congressmen, and they should be. And they also must follow the objectives. They must demonstrate how the agreement met the objectives that were set by law. And then the ITC does an evaluation. The ITC does also, has historically always done advice to USTR on what tariffs they can cut and what tariffs they shouldn't cut, things like that. Where are the sensitive products? So again, that is the traditional framework. And that's how it was supposed to work. And so the last grant of authority that similar to that was 2015. And it took 5 years, maybe longer, to reach that compromise. And eventually that framework was used. Well, they used it to negotiate the TPP, and then we know what happened to TPP. And then they used the same framework to negotiate USMCA or CUSMA or t-mec. So that's how it worked. So that's what you asked. There's your answer.
Thanks, Amy. You know, thank you, Amy. The way it worked, and you know what I'm hearing from Meredith and from Amy, Kathleen, it starts with the power abhors a vacuum, and I don't think we set out to talk about the dysfunction of Congress, but with Congress's, with these slim majorities, for one thing, but also an aggressive executive branch, certainly in Trump 1. How has the executive asserted authority both within the authorities granted and maybe redefining how they are able to use authority that has existed on the books maybe for a long time but hadn't been vigorously used before?
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. And first, let me also extend my thanks to the Institute for the generous invitation to be here. It's great to be back in the Midwest. I grew up about 2 hours south of here at the home of another land-grant university, and it just warmed my heart to get to the dairy store yesterday here. And it's been too long since I've had some of that fresh ice cream. So I'm really grateful to be here. So, Ken, I think you hit the nail on the head on exactly what's happening. Let me talk about 3 developments since 2017 that I think are noteworthy, although it's interesting to ask ourselves how much of this is old and how much of this is actually new, as you point out. So let's start with the first one. The first one that I would point to is the use of what I call security premised authorities. So these are statutory grants, there's delegations from Congress to the executive branch to be able to act in the trade space on the basis of some national security reason. And sometimes that's an explicit grant using the words national security, and sometimes it's implicit, or it may use other terminology. But I think within that underlying that is an idea of looking out for the national interest, protecting U.S. commerce from burdens and threats. And so we saw that first, that use of those authorities in the Trump administration, continuing into the Biden administration, but they're not new. Those authorities have been on the books, as Amy was suggesting, since the middle part of the 20th century. They're Cold War authorities originally that allow the president, again, to act when national security demands, and in most instances, to raise trade barriers, to put on tariffs and take other steps of that variety. So the authorities, the delegations, not new, but their increased use beginning in 2017 up to the present, that's what's new. Their extensive use, and here we're talking about things that were mentioned in our last conversation in the first panel, that of the Section 232 tariffs, the Section 301 tariffs, all of these, right, I call them the 3-digit sagas. They all have 3-digit numbers that we've come to now recognize and use. So that's the first thing I would say, Ken, is, and the reason that's happened in part is, interestingly enough, because these security premise tariffs, when Congress delegated them, they delegated and then sort of walked away, right? It's a very broad grant of authority. They had not come back and put constraints on the executive to use those. Whereas in the fast track space that Amy was just describing, in those instances where we grant the president authority to go lower barriers to trade, like in making trade agreements, there Congress has been more interventionist. So there's a bit of a dichotomy in these two types of delegations, the ones that allow the president to raise barriers, where Congress has basically said, blank check, and those, the other ones, where Congress has said, please negotiate trade agreements that would lower barriers to trade, where Congress has said, come back, talk to us, we want to be more involved. That led, I think, to where we were, again, Trump administration continuing to Biden administration. That's number one. Number two, something that is, again, old, but increased use, is that of alternatives to free trade agreements. Alternatives to free trade agreements. I call these mini deals. These are deals that are not big. They're not big USMCA. They're not big free trade agreements that lower all barriers to zero, but they're other types of deals that control the flow of goods and services into and out of the United States. Here again, we saw President Trump negotiating with Japan, two different deals of this variety. We've seen the Biden administration negotiate with Taiwan, a deal of this variety, but they're not the only ones. Those are the ones that hit the news. They hit the news, and then, no offense, Ted, to the journalists, but sometimes you don't know what these are. They sort of say, well, we don't know what to call these. Are these are kind of MOUs that, as I say, I call them mini deals to capture all of these sorts of agreements that have been negotiated for a very long time, but now trying to cover more sectors of our economy. So we've had deals that regulate the flow of everything from tomatoes to trousers to titanium to telecom, right? We have these for decades. We've had these sorts of deals that cover these things in small pieces, right? We tend to negotiate these in small pieces. Sometimes people think of them as regulatory cooperation deals, but really, if you look at their content, they're the things that, again, allow our tomatoes to come in or allow us to export our telecom, things of that nature. So we've seen more of those. We've seen them more expansive, but we've had them on the books for many years. There are more than 1,200 of these mini trade deals out there that the United States has. That's number two. And number three, then, Ken, is something that I think is totally new, which is a turn from trying to control country behavior to paying more attention to company behavior. So the Biden administration calls it its policy a worker-centered trade policy. I might also call it a firm-centered trade policy, because so much of what the Biden administration has done on trade is looking very specifically at what firms, what companies are doing and trying to influence their movement. Right, so maybe we can't influence China to such a degree that China is going to change its big policies, but we can do a lot to influence company behavior and move them out of China. Right? And you see this also, Sharon mentioned earlier, this rapid response mechanism in the USMCA, in which the USTR goes after individual companies' work sites in Mexico that are not allowing their workers to unionize, where there's a problem with collective bargaining rights at that work site. It's company specific, right? It's an extraterritorial extension of USTR's authority to what's happening at a particular work site in Mexico, and the list goes on. We could come up with other examples of this corporate accountability theme that particularly Ambassador Tai has emphasized in her remarks. So those would be my three things, Ken. I think the ways in which the executive has really exercised its authority, pushed its boundaries of what it can do in the tariff space and the deal space, and now increasingly in other regulatory activities with companies.
Thanks. I'd like to build a little bit on that and have a discussion. And, if we were on our webinar, I'd say, raise your hand or whatever if you want to jump in. But on the security issue, Kathleen, there's two things. One, in a way, the security issue's always been there. When we were talking about NAFTA 30 years ago, there was a security component to it. People didn't say the quiet part out loud, but TPP was all about China. It wasn't about knitting together a series of countries around the Pacific Rim just for the heck of it. It was to create an agreement of countries that wanted to work together and have an alternate power block, essentially, to China. So security's always been implicit, but also, I want to bring it back then to Meredith, their individual constituencies don't always think about those big picture issues of U.S. strategic importance when you're talking about what matters to an individual congressional district. That's in some ways why Congress can't negotiate trade agreements, because they all have parochial issues that they're looking at in their own district. How do you see an opportunity? Okay, so back up. Sorry, I'm just going to preface this one other way too. With USMCA, there actually was a vigorous consultative process that went on with Congress and the executive branch, the Trump administration, Bob Lighthizer, working directly with Congress. With USMCA's review coming up, which is what we've been talking about a lot this morning, is there a role? How can Congress play a role when there really isn't a fast track authority and there isn't even necessarily a negotiation that's been tabled yet? Right now it's just a review. So is there a way for Congress, and how, we talk, and I want to hear more about the ITC as well, but for Congress to weigh in and the people in this room through their members of Congress to weigh in?
Well, I'd like to back up, like to back up a little bit and just sort of talk about the example of TPP and how it evolved historically. And to me, that was a very healthy domestic political process that we had, because it spans several administrations. It was sort of conceived by different leaders in Congress and in different administrations, and working together over many, many years. Starting out with a grant of trade negotiating authority by Paul Ryan and the Obama administration, and then getting to Mike Froman, who was able to sign the agreement, and then we had a bad political end. I think probably the Obama people started too late to get it implemented. But that was a healthy process, and under the old traditional consultative, and it was a multi-sectoral process. It balanced agriculture and digital trade objectives, and we talk now a lot about sectoral agreements. I'm not sure you can accomplish as much as you can if you have a big balanced package, accomplish stuff for the U.S. economy. So, and I know you want to talk about USMCA, but I think it's still, it's just there are too many unknowns about how candidates are saying we're going to go back and have a negotiation to renegotiate USMCA. You have no negotiating authority. How do you even implement that? How does your trading partner, Mexico, think that you can deliver on whatever you promised in exchange for forcing them to do whatever you wanted them to do? So I think it's a pretty amorphous, untenable process that we've got to think through. What does Congress want their role in this to be? And it's too bad, because we have a lot of other trade negotiations all over the world that we should be involved in, but you can see how this in 2026 is going to suck up all of the trade attention in town, or most of it.
And just to ask, and Amy, we'll come back to you. Is my understanding the agreement stays in place until 2036? Without the review doesn't end the agreement. It would extend it for an additional 16-year period, but nothing ends the agreement. So the threat, I think, you need to push the little button up. There you go.
No, it's on. So I just, for those people who are watching on YouTube, oh, no, it's not up. Okay, are we on now? Okay, there. Okay, for those people watching on YouTube, I saw when somebody talked about, the Mexican, what is the Mexican public thinking, or the Mexican business community thinking about whether the U.S. can deliver on the promises it makes in the review? I saw Juan Carlos Baker shaking his head. Okay? Right. Right. So that's a good question, because I have not personally actually parsed the implementing legislation. It would be a stunning oversight if, having built in a review of this sort into the agreement, and the possibility that if you don't have unanimous, oh yes, we want this to go on just as it is forever, ever, well, at least for the next umpty-ump years, that you enter into a sort of review period, that you would have no kind of method, no mechanism to implement whatever exchanges of promises are made during the review. That would be stunning if the legislation doesn't have that. And if it doesn't, it's going to be clearly. I do understand that there are ways to adjust things like rules of origin, because, as you know, rules of origin get outmoded. You know, the rule of origin for cars is already really outmoded because in 2017, 2018, when it was negotiated, electric cars didn't exist yet, really. People didn't know what the electric car supply chain was. And you can't negotiate a rule of origin until you know what the supply chain is and what the product is. So, and who the suppliers are as well. So clearly there would be a need to modernize that, and you could adjust that by, I guess, perhaps the layover and, notification and layover provisions on tariffs. But still, that legislative question is a very good one.
Kathleen, I could see that you want to jump in here.
Well, I will, Ken, just to say maybe two things. The first is, as Amy rightly anticipates, and Sharon alluded to earlier, there is nothing in the Implementation Act to deal with changes. There is the brief bit that we got from Sharon about the what process needs to happen with stakeholders and as part of the review. And I refer folks to Simon Lester's blog, the International Economic Law and Policy blog, where he has written a number of posts about this, laying out how it is up to the executive to make the final call, and there is not a role for Congress on the general question about the review, but apart from this consultative role. And then secondly, more importantly, but with respect to changes, that's not been written in. So what do we do? And this is, I think, one among several reasons, the second thing I will say, as to why Congress really is long overdue in taking back some of its authority, revisiting the legislation. We could say this both on the tariff side as well as on the deal side. On the tariff side, one thing that some of us have suggested is to put a timeline, put a deadline in there to say, okay, if you want to do tariffs because national security or some other reason demands it, okay, executive, that's part of the reason we have this USTR, that's part of the reason we have these executive delegations, but they have a deadline, they have a time limit according to which you now need to come back to Congress and ask for permission to keep them on. Right? So this is not an eternal power that you can use. So that would be one way to handle on the tariff side. On the deal side, we did see action from Congress in response to the Taiwan deal. We did see Congress step up and say, okay, we approve your Taiwan deal, but if you do another deal with Taiwan, as USTR said it was doing, you have to come back to us. We have to be a part of the negotiations. We, Congress, will assert our constitutional role in regulating commerce with foreign nations in the context of this Taiwan negotiation. But they cabined it to just Taiwan. So what we need to see from Congress is, again, a reassertion of its authority to control the trade deal space, at least more than they have so far.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, I think, in terms of just putting a bit of perspective on where we are on the bipartisan consensus. We've had, in the last couple of years, an administration that, without Congress acting and having current trade promotion authority in place, has taken, for example, the digital trade agenda in a completely different way than the bipartisan consensus would have taken it. And so they are, in my sort of historical world, it would be unthinkable that a president could go ahead and violate trade negotiating objectives that have been in law and USMCA, which was just recently enacted into law, and pull back on a negotiating objective which was active in the WTO, in which we had a lot of trading partners depending on us, with real commercial consequences for the services industry. And I think you see Congress thinking about this. My sense would be they're going to have to act, they're going to have to legislate eventually. But they've done a lot of very kind of bipartisan, unanimous hearings about how this is not acceptable to them. And I think what's unfortunate, I think, is you're moving in a place where your trading partners don't accept your leadership. If you're going to whipsaw back and forth between different, very sort of partisan political policies, it makes it difficult for a trading partner to accept you at the table and understand you're going to be at the same place in the next year, even though you've had a lot of legislation that established that. So it's a different type of leadership that we've got at USTR, which I know they've got, meritorious objectives, I assume, but it's a violation of the process that we've been used to historically.
But again, to clarify, that was the action by Ambassador Tai to basically pull back U.S. proposals to liberalize trade in digital products in a negotiation in the WTO. And objectives which were already echoed provisions in USMCA. So she pulled back also as a result of pressure from other parts of the administration that had nothing to do with trade.
Interesting, Amy, and it's an interesting example. It ties in a lot of these things. There was an agreement reached very recently on some of these digital provisions. The U.S. was leading on these negotiations for many years, and then the U.S. pulled back on that without congressional input. In fact, Congress found out about it, I don't know, through a press release, but close enough to it. I don't think they were consulted at all. And so I guess that leads me back, and maybe Kathleen, you can pull you back in with, and again, I keep coming back to USMCA review. There's a lot more to talk about, but it's a focal point and a fulcrum where a lot of things are going to pivot off of. If there isn't congressional authority inherent or explicit in law that lets any changes that may have to go through Congress, how can the executive act without Congress? They seem to have had, certainly under President Trump, very aggressive pushing of boundaries, and the Biden administration's had a different approach to it, but some of similar outcomes. Can you talk about that a little bit? How it might play, how some of these things might play out, including the digital talks at the WTO, if you want.
So let me be brief in answering what is a long, detailed question. So I think the first thing to say is we have already seen, I mentioned earlier the Japan deals, right? One of the two Japan deals that the Trump administration negotiated did involve changes to rules of origin. And Ambassador Tai was then working in Congress and was one of the more vocal opponents to this stretching of the executive's authority to go out and try to change rules of origin, something that's usually done through legislation, but to be able to do it unilaterally as an executive branch and not bring that to Congress, she was at the time very critical of that move. And yet, that may be the way that either administration might go in a review if we want to see changes to things like rules of origin. Things, right? Typically, you will find some people will argue that the executive can negotiate anything in the trade space so long as it doesn't change U.S. law. I don't think that's the fairest depiction of how the law is set up, but that is a position that many people share. And so, okay, well, let's walk right up to the line. What can we do without changing U.S. law? Rules of origin, I think, is right on that line. And I think many would say, well, that actually would require a change to U.S. law, but we have seen the executive do it without going back to Congress. So again, the short answer to the long question, Ken, is I think you would find that either administration might seek to push that line out, tried and say, we're going to negotiate these changes to the deal, and we don't need to go back to Congress because it doesn't require a change to law.
Interesting, and a little worrying if you worry about executive power. Meredith, I want to come back. You were talking about digital. We've talked about agriculture. We've talked in different other discussions. Ted certainly did about manufacturing. Can you talk a little bit just about a multi-sectoral negotiation? Because we're talking about these silos in some ways, but there was always a benefit to multi-sectoral negotiations because you could make trade-offs across silos. And your work both in Congress, where you have multiple constituencies coming in, but also at the ITC, you had to weigh the entire impact on the whole U.S. economy, and those multiple. How are we looking at those things these days? Are we looking at a whole of an economy approach, and where the things that benefit Nebraska and benefit Michigan and benefit North Carolina and New York and California, how those all get weighed together in a negotiation by the United States?
Yeah, and that was probably the beauty of the old system in the sense that you, as I mentioned, a long list of very specific negotiating objectives that were developed through a very intense congressional process in consultation with the administration. USTR goes out and negotiates it, brings it back. They're judged against the negotiating objectives, and you have a balance that helps the whole economy. A lot of interests through Congress have been weighed into this whole process. And when you have side deals that, somebody's trading off some small thing, agriculture kind of can get hurt in that. And we're just so much more powerful as a country that we can negotiate these things comprehensively.
So I think we have about 10 minutes left. So I want to see, we have some super smart people up here and love to get your questions. We'll start with my good friend Ted Alden. Oh, we can hear your voice, Ted. You've got a booming voice.
I have a question on, there's pressure from Congress and some others, I think, for Section 301 on fentanyl imports from China. Can somebody talk, maybe Kathleen or Amy, about how much might this stretch the authority? I mean, I understood the sort of Section 301 threshold is an unreasonable burden on U.S. commerce. It's kind of hard to think through exactly how fentanyl imports are an unreasonable burden on U.S. commerce, but I mean, just how far is that stretching the 301 provision to, if the administration were in fact to launch a case on fentanyl?
Okay, back in the day, 2004, there was a petition. Can you hear me? This is not working. Can I borrow yours? Okay, back in 2004, there was a petition by the AFL-CIO against China because China, based on suppressing workers in China. Okay, so then that was actually based on something in the statute. There is, in fact, a labor rights provision in Section 301 that Congress put in there. What I've noticed about the announcements about the fentanyl petition is I haven't seen a copy of the petition. Nothing. There's a press release, there's a fact sheet, but there's no petition. I have no idea what the statutory basis of this is and whether there is a statutory basis. Now, there are also, there's a kind of a larger general question, which is, supposing you have 60% tariffs on everything from China, and there's like, trade with China stops. Although, you got to understand that means that probably the laptops that your students are writing on, they were all made in China, and Trump never put tariffs on them. Okay, cell phones made in China. So you're talking 60% tariffs on those, really, seriously? But back to the point, okay? Supposing you have no trade with China, what incentive is there for petitions like this to do anything useful, It's like stabbing a corpse. If there is no trade, then you have no trade leverage. But back to the point, I just don't know where's the petition? The AFL-CIO petition was immediately posted online, by the way.
Please.
Just 2 cents. Because I'm a law professor and I know there are law students in the room, so I can't resist commenting on and asking Ted, even if this goes through, and of course Amy highlighted important questions that remain, who would challenge it and how would that challenge fare? And so we haven't talked about the role of the courts yet in this navigating this relationship between executive and Congress. But so far, as those of you who do track the courts, that the courts have basically agreed, right, at least at the federal circuit, they have agreed with the president's decisions on all of these, right, or at least permitted him to proceed in each of these instances, whether on 301. Now, some of this is still pending, so let's be sure about that. But what we find is vast claims by the executive branch, the Department of Justice representing these trade agencies, making claims about the president's constitutional authority as also being implicated in these cases. And when those those claims are being made, the courts, with again some small exceptions, but mostly at the appellate level, they are not successful. We are mostly seeing the executive branch being able to do what it wishes with respect to these sorts of things. So in the end, does it matter if it aligns with the statute? The answer may be no.
I would add that in the Section 301 litigation, importers whose shipments had, tariffs imposed on them, okay, if you actually came to the point of imposing tariffs on Chinese imports because of fentanyl, okay, then the importer would clearly have standing to sue. That's been established in the Section 301 litigation. The other thing that has established is that the 301 process is not immune from the ordinary rules of administrative procedure. The Administrative Procedure Act applies. So, if it applies to anti-dumping, it applies to Section 301, no question. So if the government is really doing something that's completely ultra-virus, then in theory, it's refund time. God does not give the president the right to assess tariffs out of thin air. There has to be an authority, an actual delegation by Congress.
Yes, please.
Maybe as we're thinking about the larger global trading system, it was mentioned the micro deals that have been being done. I've traveled around the world enough to know that a lot of other countries are making major trade deals, and we are not. Is there any space at which you can make enough of these small deals to really even move the dial relative to more substantial deals that I feel like are needed to just even catch up with the world?
I think people in the UK are now asking this about Brexit, whether the many mini deals that the UK government is making will ever make up for losing the market access that they left when they left the EU.
I completely agree that you can kind of do these one-off things to solve little small problems, but it's chump change compared to doing a comprehensive multilateral or sectional regional agreement.
I do want to point out regarding the UK, they're about to join the TPP, which is really, they have the Pitcairn Islands are in the middle of the Pacific, so the UK has been able to claim that they're connected, that there's a connection. And I believe the EU is actually trying to figure out how to weasel their way in to the TPP as well, and the US is watching all this happen. Tahiti. Oh, okay. French Polynesia, is that? Yeah, okay. There you go. Kathleen?
Maybe just one footnote on this. So I think it's a great question because one issue is it's very difficult to measure what is the economic impact of some of these deals. And I'd be happy to chat offline. There is an economist in Brussels who has done this for the EU mini deals. And if you look at, for example, mutual recognition agreements, those agreements in some sectors actually arguably have a greater economic impact than some EU FTAs. And so, again, I guess the answer is always, again, a good law answer is it depends. But it's something that we're trying to get to the bottom of, trying to measure better so that we can make these arguments and say, hey, in these sectors, that actually might be a good way to go. In these sectors, not so much.
That's true. In particular sectors, particularly highly regulated products, that would include probably processed food, which affects people in this room, okay? So you could imagine that a mutual recognition agreement would actually have a really appreciable impact on delivering more market access. But again, what the UK lost with the EU was huge amounts of friction-free trade in all kinds of products like that, processed food, cars, the works. And now they're trying to build back, bit by bit.
Take it over here. Carlo, I think, has a question for us.
Yeah, a technical question. The last time the U.S. imposed across-the-board tariffs, 71, there weren't other trade agreements. There wasn't a North American agreement. How the heck does this work? I've talked with the authors of the idea, American Compass, and they're keeping this to their vest. Lighthizer hasn't given specifics, but from your perspective, what would happen if Trump comes in week number 1 or week number 3 and says, we're implementing the global baseline tariff, technically, what would happen? What would the steps be? How could it work?
Kathleen, I think.
Sure, and I can refer you to the WITA event of last week when we talked about this. I think the lowest hanging fruit, I'll be curious if my co-panelists agree, but the lowest hanging fruit is the successor tariff, successor statute to the one Nixon used in the example that you mentioned. So that in that instance, it was the Trading with the Enemy Act. The successor tariff. I keep saying that. Successor statute is the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which President Trump threatened to use back in 2019 to put tariffs on Mexico, on products from Mexico, and came up to the line there, right? He declared the national emergency, right? So these are the steps. Declare a national emergency under this IEPA statute. Once the president declares a national emergency, that then opens up a list of possible economic actions that the president can take, which arguably could include tariffs. And so that seems to be the simplest pathway to do that. Again, he almost did it in 2019, just didn't actually go forward with those tariffs, but he said he was going to use IEPA to do that, and one could imagine that being a pathway to doing that in this instance. So those are the steps: declare a national emergency under IEPA, and then put those tariffs in place. But again, happy to chat more.
I think we have about 1 minute left if there's any other questions. Yes, right here.
Matt Schaefer with the University of Nebraska. Question, so Congress did step in for the Taiwan deal, and they did say for future ones, here's the process. But that was reactive. It's very hard on the trade restrictive side to limit these delegations now. If you don't include a sunset in a delegation, you may be out of luck forever. The delegation may last forever because you need 2/3 in both houses to get rid of it. But on the deal side, why doesn't Congress, or are there discussions for Congress to basically use that, even if it's not a full renewal of fast track, right, to at least say, you can't go forward with the deals with at least these minimal procedures and with our approval?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think we're waiting for Congress to move, and I think they will. I mean, I think you see them, the Taiwan was a statement that this is, our purview, and we need to follow some particular procedures that the administration didn't. But it's a difficult political calculation that they have to make. So, and I think you'll see this as we get into the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, looking at that next year. I mean, there's going to be a big swirl of a lot of Ways and Means and Finance Committee legislation, and they're going to have to put down some guardrails, but very unclear to see how they'll do it and in what form.
And that's an interesting point. There are going to be some action-forcing events in Congress in the coming year. The Trump taxes that were passed, a lot of those expire, so that's on the revenue side at least. And Congress can be creative sometimes in attaching legislation to revenue measures within some of the special rules that let them get 50 votes. So there could be some creative ways that Congress, I presume, or not presume, I believe could reassert itself in some of that must pass 50, and those are legislations that only need 50 votes and can't be filibustered. Kathleen, did you want to jump in on a final word?
So there have been multiple opportunities for Congress to have done this in the Trump administration as well as in this administration. And as has been suggested, it is just not a priority among all the other things that, of course, are occupying Congress's time or not, as Amy was suggesting earlier. We thought it might move as part of a China package. At some point, that was the discussion, like, let's get in some trade deal revision authority as part of a bigger China package, not come to pass. Now entering the lame duck, I think we're now going to be in a period of re-educating and bringing, new members will need to be brought up to speed on what the issues are. But I want to say, rest assured, although I have no, Meredith's more optimistic than I am, there is draft legislation. It has been there before the committees for some time, and there's sort of a menu of possibilities that Congress could undertake to do that, limiting the executive's role, but still empowering it to get the job done for the United States. I don't see that on any sort of fast track or slow track in the coming year.
I will say, and you said lame duck, I forgot, we hadn't mentioned that. In the time after the election, before a new Congress is sworn in, there's a period of time in which Congress will have some wrap-up business. And we don't know what will happen in a week from today with the election, but different makeups of the House and Senate and the executive could lead to some year-end legislation, and some things could get tacked on. We've talked in the trade world about generalized system of preferences. There's some expiring provisions in trade that may be included in some things, or at least there's folks who are trying to. So there could be some things we see even in the next couple months. Jill, did you want to take it? Well, I think that wraps up our time. Thank you to our panel. Thanks to all of you.